Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world right now. Today is the last day of the Merle Conference, and we are super excited to be talking about elections in the US, but also in other parts of the world, such as Sub-Saharan Africa. So this morning, I'll be introducing our moderator, Ms. Salem Solomon of Voice of America Africa, who will be leading and moderating our discussion today. She has reported across the continent and also works in the Amharic and Tigrinya service. So Ms. Solomon, please lead the discussion.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Victoria. Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the biometrics revolution, election technology, and digital democracy in Africa. We have great panels joining us today, but a little bit of overview of the landscape of what it looks like in Africa. For decades, the idea that an African head of state would be voted out of office and leave willingly was difficult to imagine. And based on what we've been reporting and covered for years, it almost never happened. Elections were rigged, tabulations fabricated, and many leaders won elections by comically lopsided margins. This was the norm for years. But recently, we've seen some evidence that this is changing. Long-standing autocrats, including Yahya Jammeh of the Gambia, have lost elections and have been forced to accept results. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the handpicked successor of longtime President Joseph Kabila is lost by a significant margin and was forced to concede defeat. And yes, there are conflicting reports of a rigged election. But on the other side, there's been also evidence that institutions are bolstering the legitimacy of elections, most notably in Kenya in 2017, when the Supreme Court made history in Africa by invalidating results and ordering a second vote. So although there is still much cause for concern about the integrity of elections in some parts of the continent, much of the recent gains are thanks to technological advances. And voting is potentially harder, relatively speaking, to manipulate when there are technological safeguards, and it's easy to track. In 2014, for instance, Namibia became the first African country to use electronic voting machines. A number of countries, including Ghana, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, have implemented or are in the process of implementing biometric voter identification systems to cut down on fraud. Here, I'd like to mention that voter fraud seems like a separate issue than rigged elections, say. But in today's discussion, we would like to explore ideas to see if there is evidence of voters attempting to manipulate outcomes. Are they voting twice, for example? Could it be that biometric IDs can also be used to ensure the overall legitimacy of elections by allowing for easier independent observations or observers? So those are the ideas that we plan to explore. But across Africa, 60% of countries are planning to launch or renew their identity programs in the next coming 2 years, according to goodid.org. It's an online platform advocating for digital privacy and security. But national programs such as national identity cards and biometric voter ID can be linked to corrupt bidding process, and technological failures can undermine public confidence in several systems across the continent. So there are also privacy concerns with countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, which has begun building massive database of their citizenry, following an example by China as one of the examples that we've seen so far. So how can we get this right? Today, we are joined by a panel of experts who study this very closely and this issue very closely and are working to implement it in different institutions across the continent. I would like to start with a general question. What sort of technology is being used in African countries to safeguard elections? Marielle Debos, if you could start with exploring this idea. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Salem, and all of you for this invitation. So my own research is on the rollout of biometric identification technologies on the continent, and I focus specifically on the use of biometrics for elections, because you know that biometrics can be used for a wide range of purposes, for the building of national identification system, for law enforcement, for the management of borders. And in Africa, there is something quite specific, the use of biometrics for elections. And biometrics can be used at the first step of the organization of election, the first step being the registration of voters. And now 24 countries on the continent use biometric identification to identify or to register the voters. That's a figure by the International ID, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. So they show that half of the countries of the continent use fingerprints and photos to register the voters. And then some countries like Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria also use voter authentication on polling day. That it means that they are biometric devices on polling day in the polling station, and voters have to identify themselves before they are allowed to cast their ballot. So biometrics has raised many expectations in the various countries. In many countries, the opposition urges for the use of election technologies and of biometrics for the elections. But in many cases, the results have not been that good. I studied an in-depth study in Chad, a country where I have done research for the past 15 years. And what biometrics did in Chad is a more accurate voter roll, but it doesn't change the political context. It doesn't change the many possibilities of fraud and rigging. And what I noticed is that the biometrics has been marketed and promoted as a solution to some administrative problem, like the lack of national population register in many African countries, but it has also been promoted as a solution against fraud. And this is where it becomes very problematic. In many countries, the question is not the technology. The main question, the main concerns are the political context. And in a country where, like Chad, where political violence has not completely withered away, does it make sense to pay a lot of money to buy sophisticated biometric technologies to organize an election where there was no surprise? We know that the president would be re-elected.
Mm-hmm. You make a very good example referencing Chad, for instance. What other countries are using biometric tools to identify voters? And also, I assume that it differs by country. So how does this work? Because it's something like in the US, for instance, where you simply register and vote by filling out a form or possibly confirming your identity and address. But in other countries, if anybody wants to take this, how does it work? In Kenya, for instance, Ms. Bonyo, if you want to take it. I think your audio is muted.
Sorry. So Kenya, I'll speak for Kenya and maybe most of East Africa. Governments have tried to, take up registration of voters via biometrics. We have had that in 2 instances in Kenya in 2013 and 2017. We also have at the point of voting where voters would actually come in, verify their identity via biometrics, and then vote, manually. We haven't got to, sort of automating the voting process. The reason why, in my view, governments have gone ahead to, purchase these technologies is because of the kickbacks involved. You want to talk about digital elections, but there's just a small part of the electoral process that's biometric. We also have not figured out how to have a continuous method of voter registration, and so you have maybe 2 months to elections or 6 months to elections. That's when we begin the entire call to register in somebody who turned 18, because the age of voting is 18 years old. And mostly you need to have a national identity system. And so we find even having a biometric system is, not really far removed from, having an identity. You must have sort of an identity to be able to vote in that particular case. So I think in general, East Africa, we still have a long way to go in making good use of technology in our elections, especially with government procured services. And I think I'd want to just point out on the role of the West. So people may wonder why would the global North be concerned about elections in Africa? Most of the technologies that are used, actually I'd say all of the technologies that are used on elections in Africa is mostly, global North sourced. We have France supplying, French companies, supplying our digital ID system here and electoral system as well. We've had issues around it. And there's a famous case, the court case in 2017 in Kenya. We had the presidential petition in court, and the court said we need to access the server, so that they would know how the elections went. But they said we cannot access the server because the server is in France and they're asleep, which of course, as you know, if you're in technology, if it's a server, it's a server. Unless it's down, there is every way that you could access it. And so I think examining that link between the supply, issues of vendor lock-in, who's supplying these particular technologies, and what kickback exists for government, in the case of this particular technologies being procured for African elections.
Thank you so much for that, specific example that you mentioned. I think Ms. Munyua also wants to chime in, but how is access to technology, like what Ms. Bonyo was saying, changing how people organize or express political opinions in Kenya, for instance? Or is there any concern about the government restricting this or attempting to limit access because of your work and the work that you've done, Ms. Munyua?
Okay, I just want to follow up, good segue to what my colleague Linda, I'm Kenyan too, has spoken about the use of biometrics in elections and the rush towards implementing this an advancement of implementing this digital ID. Obviously, there's a lot of positive discussion about it, especially now with the coronavirus pandemic. There's an additional opportunity to advance digital ID, yet there's an ongoing fight related both to the health crisis and how it impacts our election. And what she has raised here about tech companies and vendors, pushing digital ID are controlled and profit-driven from North America, Europe, and China companies. And on top of that, then development agencies like the World Bank that have no less than 63 ID projects in emerging economies over the past 15 years. So you can see a deliberate effort to encourage countries to upgrade from analog ID to, or to leapfrog, and to scale up, companies scaling up operations. Yet in contrast, almost all Western countries have seen these new digital ID projects involving, even just photographs being opposed and eventually defeated on the grounds of, for example, privacy, like in the US, in the UK, in Canada, in France, in Australia, while both Linda and I get confused why emerging economies, keep being pushed, despite the fact that organizations like ours, Lawyers Hub, Mozilla, the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and others are constantly raising concerns, and yet laws are being passed either, when it comes to elections, using digital ID for elections, or just simply authorizing the collection of biometrics, including, for example, in Kenya, the DNA. So it's really concerning. And the domination of foreign companies, we have to acknowledge that tech is not neutral. Often what it just does is improve and build on existing biases, which results in increased discrimination and violations of civil rights. So we find ourselves not just having to fight for equal rights even during election periods, but also fighting, fights we've had for decades, around gender discrimination, misogyny, anti-Black racism. It's exhausting. And for the Africa region, I want to harp on this issue of foreign domination of tech companies. It's simply colonialism. If you apply a simple definition to it, it's the practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country or territory, occupying it, exploiting it. Yet there's not a single story about African elections and how they are wrought with post-violence conflict. None of those discussions actually bring into account or take into account or reflect the technology that was used, who owns it, where it's coming from, how these digital technologies are actually impacting, or perhaps even exacerbating those violence, and the relationships, the historical relationship we have with Europe vis-a-vis colonialism, and how Europe expanded its borders of control. This is really interesting. Fought wars by proxy, drained the continent of wealth, established an often violent system of governance, and instituted a global, pattern of slavery that we know, and then developed a rule law that is only applied to Europeans, but then was taken up by the rest of the world with a mandate for full human rights. So what we see in terms of ownership of digital technology is simply colonial rulers again deploying what they did previously, methods of scientific discovery. They used to test methods of scientific discovery on the African continent. They're doing it again, experimenting with digital ID tech systems that are being implemented, and with our elections. So there's a lot that needs to be done. Yes, sorry.
Ms. Munyua, you make a very good, connection with existing systems and the continuation of colonial, connections. But if we bring it back to the present day, for instance, and based on what you've done and all the work that you've done, what about current governments and the restriction that they have on different countries to limit access? And we've seen a trend as election years, restriction of technology, internet is so rampant. And I can list many countries, if you could speak to that.
Yes, there are many countries that are doing it, and we condemn that as Mozilla and at a personal level. But at the same time, I don't really believe that technology is a solution. And to take you back to elections, in Malawi, for example, they shifted from analog to biometric ID. A company based in the Netherlands called Laxton Group supplied the biometric ID for their general elections. But that did not avert the crisis that followed, where, there were alleged tampering of polling station numbers. So the election was nullified by a panel of judges, and it called into question the integrity of that electoral process. So what again is the role of ID? And yes, the problem with the kind of discrimination we're seeing from African governments just simply end up, moving from being offline to online, or technology being used to continue exacerbating those, that level of discrimination. In Kenya, for example, as Linda was mentioning, there are groups of people, communities of people who never even got, legal ID or analog ID from the start, and they're not likely to be getting it even before the elections. And so that's the level of discrimination. Shutting down the internet is another one, of trying to, make sure that they're influencing the kind of information that their citizens get, either prior to elections with the excuse of either exam cheating, or there are all sorts of excuses that come up. So I'm not in any way saying that African governments are not to blame for a lot of the issues that we see, especially when it comes to denying technology when it's most needed. But I'm also saying that we also need to look at the historical factors. And if we are not going to do that, we have to look at, for example, the vendors. You're not going to look at that we are not really discussing the problem in its entirety. What we're doing is cherry picking the problems.
I see what you're saying. Well,
Yes.
thanks for that example. And I recognize that in some parts, in East Africa and Ethiopia, this exam, is being used as, students leaking exam answers and things like that. Let's go back to West Africa now. Mr. Emmanuel Brown, what have been some of the challenges in implementing national identification cards and identification, not just cards, but in Ghana? And I believe that Ghana card is often used as a model for a national ID system, but biometric voter identification has had some challenges recently. As you are looking at election, if you could share some of your experience and work that you've done with us, thank you. Mic is muted. You'll have to, excuse me, you'll have to turn on your mic. It's muted. Oh,
yeah.
I can hear you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. the Ghana project has successfully ended with the mass registration exercise. We currently have over 15 million biometric and biographic records in our database. We've issued over 14 million smart cards to our citizens. The project is actually a novel one in the sense that in the whole of Africa, there hasn't been any country that has deployed the kind of technology we have done, in the sense that we deployed mobile registration workstations onto the field. We collected biometrics, biographic data, that's enrollment, and we did live deduplication of the biometrics, and we were able to issue smart cards instantly to applicants. And the challenges, the initial challenges were so many. You know, in Africa, our technology infrastructure is not that robust to support such an initiative. But when the project got started, we were having serious challenges with connectivity. You know, people were far from the nation's capital, Accra, and they were in the hinterlands, and we need to link to the database, the central service in Accra. So it got to a point we had to contact the telcos to support, to boost connectivity in certain areas where we realized connectivity was low. And we were successful, and we're now going to do the continuous enrollment, registration. Basically, the challenges with the start of this new project, you know, we started a project in 2008, a national ID project, a similar thing, but we never deployed instant issuance of cards. What we did was to enroll eligible applicants on the field, put the records on the CUD, come back to Accra, the head office, to run the deduplication. And after that, we did the production. We printed over 3 million cards for the citizens. That was in 2010. We did the production. We printed 3 million cards. But when we got back to the field to do the distribution to the applicants, we realized that a lot of the applicants had moved from their initial places of registration to other places. So we're not able to get the cards to the applicants. Moving forward, we thought of coming out with such a novel project where we would do the data collection, and right there we personalize smart cards and issue. So basically, this has been the Ghana project. And all this while, from 2008 to date, the challenges have been so many. Basically, we can talk of inadequate political consensus. You know, in Ghana, we have two major political parties, the National Democratic Congress and the New Patriotic Party. And this, the National ID project in 2008 was initiated by the government of the New Patriotic Party. And there wasn't a much buy-in from the major opposition party by then, which is the National Democratic Congress. So when the project started, along the line 2008, there was an election which the NDC lost again. So 2010, when we were doing production, there were several challenges. Funds were not forthcoming, just because there was a little political, strife here and there. So the political consensus went from what we have learned. If you don't get the political consensus from the major political parties and you want to initiate any digital identity program, then it's likely, you are bound to fail. Because when there is a change of government, the whole project comes to a halt. And then there is another challenge with legal and regulatory framework gaps. We have institutions like the Electoral Commission, the National Identification Authority, National Health Insurance. all trying to go to the field to collect biometrics for a common purpose. One, to issue cards to eligible citizens for healthcare, for elections. And the National Identification Authority was actually established to be the mother of all the biometrics. So all these institutions needed to do was to wait for the National Identification Authority, build a central database where they can then extract whatever records they need to compile any list for either elections or health insurance purposes. But they never understood why they were in existence before the establishment of the National Identification Authority. So they thought it wise to also go ahead, and they had, when there was a change of government, they had the backing to also go and do their own, build their own database, collect biometrics. Aside that, to determine who is eligible to enroll onto such a register, a national identity register, is also a major issue. Legal identity and digital identity are not the same. In our part, in Ghana, for instance, the major legal identity is the birth certificate. And our birth and death registry is not strengthened enough to, get birth registration done, real time. It takes a longer period. You have to go visit the offices of the birth and death registry several times before you can, get a birth certificate. And it is the basic requirement for onboarding into any digital ID system here in Ghana. So that is another major challenge. So moving forward, this project, we just finished with the mass registration. We were able to, because we knew that a lot of the potential eligible applicants may not have the legal document, which is the birth certificate or a passport, to enroll into this new digital ID system, where the National Identification Authority thought it wise to recruit and train officials that we call the commissioners for oath, who were mandated to allow potential applicants who don't have any of the legal verification documents, such as the birth cert or the passport, to go through a vouching process to get enrolled into the national identity system. Mm-hmm. So that's challenge of not.
It seems like there is, anybody who's been in, not just in Africa, but the bureaucracy that's involved in getting any kind of legal documents. You raise a very good point, and it's very pertinent because of what's happening in Ghana. So bringing it back to biometrics, is there hope that biometrics would allow for more access to the ballot box? There's been concerns about ID card, like what you mentioned, be it birth certificate or other requirements that effectively block people from voting in some instances. So do biometrics address this? Ms. Debos, if you want to take that.
Yes,
sure.
Biometrics has been deployed under the guise of democracy or development. And this is what is very complex and very exciting about this debate. Legal ID is a development and human rights issue because people need ID papers to be able to vote or to access welfare grants, for example. But at the same time, biometric and digital ID put people at risk. There is the risk of surveillance, there is the risk linked to security breaches with the databases. So biometrics can put at risk the very people the technology is supposed to empower. I would like to circle back to the question of imperialism, because it is a key question. And as a French citizen, I'm also very concerned about the role of French companies on the continent. You know, the French ID, digital ID and biometric ID companies are dominate the landscape, or they are among the major players on the continent. And it is very it is interesting to see where the French companies get their market, and very often they're very present in former French colonies, which is not coincidental. So And also on this, as Alice said earlier, tech companies tend to use Africa as a testing ground. And this is the case because many African countries don't have the required legal framework to protect their citizens. Many countries have very weak or non-existent legal framework to protect the citizens and to protect the privacy of the citizens. Now, and also what many countries still need is data protection authorities. So I think this is the way forward. These countries need to do more to strengthen their regulation, their legal framework, and to build capacity for these data protection authorities. This is a question not only for Africa, this is a key question for every country in the world, including France or the US. We know that personal information is a valuable community today, but this is especially the case in countries that don't have the means, the legal means, and the framework to protect their citizens.
That's a very good point about nascent democracies as well and legal systems to protect privacy. And this is not unique to Africa. And it's in the issue being discussed here in the US and Europe and other parts of the world. Ms. Bonyo, since Ms. Debos mentioned legal structures, I understand you've worked to improve the tech policy in Kenya, particularly as it pertains to the judicial system. And can you describe how technology is affecting justice and the court system in Kenya? Does it give more people access? Is it improving transparency and accountability from your work?
I think we are still at an nascent stage on the use of technology and the development of tech policy. I'd talk about access. The courts in Kenya have, quickly adapted during COVID to get to virtual courts. So a lot of the courts in Kenya now are sitting online through Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And we have, the lawyers on board. The general public is still grappling with, access to courts. And in light of elections, I think the problem first emanates from the legal profession. In 2017, during the Supreme Court ruling in Kenya, we had, just very little knowledge around, elections and technology and how to regulate that. We didn't have a legal framework, and we also lacked the jurisprudence, that the judges could borrow from. And so a lot of the lessons that we were trying to pick were coming in either from South Africa or just basically from the global north. We had the first, I think the first nullification of presidential elections in 2017. And I think that's at the point where we decided to form and set up the Lawyers Hub, because we felt that lawyers could do more, in helping to monitor elections and also coming in to litigate electoral petitions and electoral disputes. Two, on the structure and the legal framework, I think in understanding the separation of powers, if we talk about countries where you have a very strong judicial system, and then you also have a very strong president, and there's this check and balance. Many countries in Africa lack that check and balance. We had the Chief Justice in Kenya cancel the elections then, but we have seen the repercussions of him canceling the elections. What happened then is the government would reduce budgetary allocations because the executive is basically in charge of, resources. And so they would not resource the judicial system unless they played ball. We also had sessions where they just didn't want to listen to the Chief Justice. And so it's important that if we're putting in the regulatory framework, we also must look at, from the very framework of your constitution, is a judicial system able to survive, politically and resource-wise, away from the political class, and also too, there's a question on violence. Our electoral laws do not cover situations of violence as it should. And so using technology and hoping that technology would help us to avoid violence would not work, because our problems are deep-seated. You have tribes already fighting on issues around land. You have people who do not have identity and they are refugees, with host communities. Already there is, animosity between these particular people. And so elections simply serve to, exacerbate these particular situations or increase them, whether they are online elections or digital elections or not, you know. And I think finally, we have grappled with this issue in Kenya on how do you have, you know, a tech election from the beginning to the end. You know, the question in Kenya was, for the elections, was on transmission of results. And so if you're looking at a framework in which you can actually hold people culpable, you'd have people taken to court, they stole the election, but under what law are you going to charge them under when your regulatory framework has actually not been changed in that particular sense? So I agree with Alice that we need to have a sort of comprehensive, you know, method, and just not looking at the biometric aspect of elections alone. We also need to look at capacity building. How do you improve the skills of lawyers, the skills of policymakers, to ensure that they understand that technology can actually limit, you know, democracy, that people would, you know, be shut down just because they don't understand how they need to monitor elections. For your information, the EU observers, the US observers, and the African Union observers in 2017 said that the elections had no irregularities. It was near perfect. And then the court said, no, there were irregularities. And that was them having egg on their face, you know. But we have a skill lacking on how do you send me with my paperwork to monitor an election that is transmitted on technology and already has artificial intelligence, you know, like formulas embedded where the winner has to get 54% regardless of how many votes, you know, the loser sort of gets, you know. So I think we need to look at how do we improve the technology, one, but how do we improve also the people, the citizens who are observing elections, because people go to schools because we vote in, you know, in schools and mostly learning institutions. So how do you let a villager know that you can actually monitor these elections, that your biometrics was taken, the results are transmitted on, you know, on a digital platform? I think we have a long way to go in that particular sense, even as we reform the law.
Yes, I mean, these structures are very integral and important. I remember being in Kenya in 2017 or so, and you mentioned ethnic tensions and all these things that are interlinked. So it all goes hand in hand. But the technology aspect of it is also important. And I see Ms. Munyua shaking your head with agreement. But I want to get into the technologies. I've always wondered, you know, some biometrics technologies, for example, face scans or fingerprints. What are they, is one better than the other? And what hardware is required to incorporate biometrics into elections? When you think about the technical aspect of improving this, how much are countries in Africa, be it in Kenya and other parts of the continent, 50 plus, relying on individual smartphones? Smartphones are in everyone's hands, and especially you mentioned a villager in Kenya, for instance, not being able to, you know, get access. And so if you can give us an understanding, Ms. Munyua, throw this one to you, if you want to piggyback from what Ms. Bonyo explained as well.
Or in terms of what technologies, I mean, you know, I think most of us know that a lot of people in the Africa region access the internet, for example, most of the time for the first time in their lives using the mobile phones. And that most of them, when they're accessing, in fact, that figure is about 74% of Africans who access their internet using a mobile phone for the first time, and only 24% from other devices when you want to talk about the technology. And on those mobile devices, most of us tend to do nearly everything, including banking and, you know, looking for information, you know, not sure about voting. I'm not an expert here, but then also to piggyback on what, you know, Linda is saying, technology is not neutral. And whoever creates that technology creates it with all the biases that they have. And we've seen that, for example, with the, you know, a great book, you know, Algorithms of Oppression, and, you know, and how, for example, in the United States, facial recognition has impacted on Black people. Some of them have ended up in prison, you know, for not being the real people. And so I think, you know, and as referred earlier, that danger of surveillance by both private and public sector. But then also, you know, the context when it comes to elections in the Africa region is also unique. So we can't just blanket and say, oh, this, because violence happens in Ethiopia or Kenya or wherever, that the whole continent can be lumped. And so we experience election violence just because of one single thing. There's a lot that goes on when it comes to elections. For example, the cohesion. And the cohesion here, when I'm talking about election cohesion, it's also the cohesion in getting those digital IDs. I know in Kenya, we were being forced to go and register for that Huduma number. Failure to, you would not be able to access, very essential public services. We saw that happen in India with people dying as a result of not, they don't, some of them, for example, because they're HIV positive, they don't want to be stigmatized, they don't want to register in that digital ID system, so they'd rather not, so they actually miss out on their, on their meds. And so when it comes to election here, the whole idea of cohesion, how violence is manifested, coups and counter coups that we experience, and they have certain patterns in themselves. And I'm not saying that elections, for example, are inherently the source of violence. As Linda is alluding to, when elections in themselves are not, they inherently are not violent, but they do increase, the whole issue of political, ethnic, regional, and religious tensions. And we see that usually spilling over to extreme violence. But most analysis, exactly. But most analysis on election-related violence tend to focus, yet again, on factors that of the immediate conditions. Were the machines working? Was there, we even forget something. Was there power? Were the electoral commissions, doing the right things? Were the international monitors, really monitoring? Were there peacekeepers there to oversee the electoral management organization? And then they failed to really always not consider historical factors. Like, once again, I'll keep repeating our colonial legacy, our political legacy. Most of our countries are coming from a single party to multiple party. So the way politicians mobilize support, either resources in terms of money and others, is also a key to consider here when you're analyzing, how elections, work. And some
how they play out. We were getting audience questions here, and one of the questions actually really tapped into what you were just exactly saying here about, how the use of biometric technology has been able to prevent losing parties and their supporters from contesting electoral results and improving public confidence, because at the end of the day, it's about public trust as well. And in the legitimacy of elections, I'm thinking of election-related violence in Cote d'Ivoire. You made, you discerned between violence and election, how they're not really linked. It's just tapping into an existing,
dynamic.
If anybody wants to take this, it's one of the audience questions coming our way. Thank you.
I'll quickly answer that and say, no, the digital ID do not in any way, avoid election violence. Instead, on the contrary, they tend to increase in it, especially when, for example, you look at the case of Kenya, where we've politicized ethnic identity. So because we've politicized ethnic identity, the digital ID simply just carry that on. Thank you.
Anybody wants to add on? And the second audience question coming our way is more practical: privacy and security risks. Specifically, what can be done to mitigate those risks? He asked legal and regulatory frameworks, questioning that, if there's any theory that any of you have that you want to share.
I think on privacy and security risks, we have many countries within the continent are now leaning towards having, privacy-related laws. We have Kenya that recently passed its privacy data protection law in November of 2019. We have Uganda that did that earlier in the year, around February 2019. We have Ghana that was, way ahead in that, and Mauritius as well, that have come up with data protection laws. However, having one law is another. We've seen a trend within this, within the building of these privacy laws. One, you have governments having an exemption and exempting themselves from these particular laws. And so you have a law that covers everyone except government. And, when you talk about privacy, usually it's either big tech companies or governments that are a huge violator of, privacy related laws. So I think that's one huge gap. Two, you can have a data protection framework, but then that is really under-resourced in terms of personnel as well as, monetary, resources. In Kenya, for instance, we have a data protection commissioner that just has never been appointed, so you have an office that, exists on paper and it's great for PR when we talk about Kenya having this and that, but it actually doesn't have any sort of resources. In Uganda, we have a very thin, skeleton of law around privacy that actually needs to have more regulations on it. Nigeria is working on its data protection law and it's in draft stage now. And so I think across the continent, many countries are trying to get to that point. But in regards to elections, I think the problem with elections is also the procurement system. We haven't got to the point where, especially civil society and lawyers haven't got to a point of skill where we are asking the right questions that, tell us about the back end. What does this technology do? When government is procuring these technologies, are we able to ask the question, what are the privacy, safeguards within this particular technology? Is it open source? Who else can have access to this particular data? I think we still are lacking in that. And a great learning from Kenya is that it's civil society that took government to court around digital identity, and the court made pronouncements around privacy and said Kenya would not adopt any digital identity system without a privacy framework. And they said that our current Data Protection Act does not provide adequate safeguards, for citizen data. And the data that our government was collecting included your DNA information, included your GPS location, and government required you to update your details. If you moved house or changed your phone number, you had to inform government. And I want to tie this to elections because right now, the main sort of opposition leader in Kenya has already filed a complaint that, data from our digital identity system, which is Huduma number, is going to be used for elections, and so we are preparing ourselves now, and everybody's seeing the concerns that privacy professionals had before, that collecting too much data is going to affect you actually during elections. And then it brings us to the point of surveillance. In Kenya, we lost our, IT officer who was in charge of elections. A few days to the elections, he was murdered because he had, the sort of logins to the national system. So I think privacy concerns are key and security concerns are key. There were claims of hacking of the system. I think those are necessary, but what do we do about it? I think the continent is ripe for upskilling. We need to pump in more money, not even on scholarly writings, because we still lack that scholarly writing, but there needs to be more resources channeled towards training, increasing the capacity of civil society for the lawyers, and that's what we're trying to do at the Lawyers Hub, and learning from the Kenyan case that, and even for Zimbabwe and Zambia, learning from the case that election is not an event. The courts have said that election is a process, and it needs to be discussed even when there is no election. We need to be discussing what's happening in Tanzania, what's happening in Uganda way before they begin the electoral process.
That's actually a very good point about election being a process. And I think Mr. Brown mentioned it earlier when he was talking about details and challenges. If you want to chime in about privacy issues in Ghana, for instance, if you want to share with us, just to follow up with what Ms. Bonyo is saying about what's happening in Kenya and what to learn from, and how that applies in West Africa and in the country that you are in, Ghana, as well. Thank you. Mr. Brown.
Yeah. Yes. Ghana has a data protection law, and there's a commission like Kenya, Linda mentioned. We have the commissioner, but it's not adequately resourced in terms of the human resource to be able to do what the Act requires. As we speak now, there is a cybersecurity bill before Cabinet, and we're hoping before elections in December, that bill will be passed into law, and that will help with cyber, attacks on our national, identity infrastructure. There have been several attempts to hack into, especially our national identity database. And with the coming of the cybersecurity law, we hope more will be done to check all those activities by, individuals who don't mean well for the country. Data protection, personally, has not been encouraging in Ghana, because the Electoral Commission of Ghana ended up giving a whole database to a private company, which ended up in court, and the case is still in court. So there is no much trust in the people to donate or, give their fingerprints to be collected into a central database and all that. So there is more to be done to strengthen the Data Protection Commission. And then we expect that currently we have the Cybersecurity Center, which will also be turned into an authority after the Cybersecurity Act is, the law is promulgated.
Okay.
So
We're
hoping a lot more will be done.
Yeah, that's a very good point about a private company being taken to court. And also, Ms. Munyua was talking about the colonial legacy and the connection and the relationship that these countries or Western countries would have with African countries. But one thing that I would like to point to all of you, and maybe Ms. Debos would touch on this, is that there are private companies that are heavily involved in this, but also governments. One audience question that has come our way is, I'd like to know more or hear more about the role China is playing in this biometric revolution. And China is investing an important amount of money in building infrastructure, the mobile industry. I don't need to go on and on about this. But what about other countries like China? I remember in the DRC election, South Korean voting machines were coming in, and Jesus, any of you seen how controversial that was? The difference between private companies and government being involved in this discussion. Ms. Debos, if you want to take on this. Your mic is muted. Yeah.
Yeah, in the DRC, they use South Korean voting machines that were considered as defect in South Korea. And I think that it raises a more general question about what is ironic about the deployment of election technologies on the continent. As election technologies are being deployed, they are very much criticized elsewhere in the world. Voting machines have been criticized in the US for quite a long time. In France, we use our ID card and we just put a paper ballot in an envelope and we just put it in the box. Like, it's very low tech. And it's quite ironic that these election technologies have been promoted as a solution against fraud, as the right path to democratization, when they are at the same time so much criticized elsewhere. And one of the reasons for that is also corporate interest and the aggressive marketing strategies of the companies who market their product as not only solutions to administrative problems, not only not only simple solutions, but also as solutions, and they also contribute to this idea that technologies could help change things when the things that need to be changed are very social and very political.
Mm-hmm. It seems like you're also, technologies are made by humans, and I think Ms. Munyua also mentioned earlier that some of the biases are infiltrating into the technologies. They're built by human beings who have biases as well, different biases. And so I think you touched on that as well. Anybody wants to chime in and add on this issue?
I was just going to mention on the question of China within the continent, we have had cases in Zambia where the election was considered a referendum against China, and we also have the questions on Sierra Leone where it was publicly, have Chinese supporting, China government supporting specific, quarters in that case. So I think China has a lot to do in Africa because, especially the African elections, the winner takes it all. So if you get the presidency, then you get the business, you get the tenders, you make the road. And so China is very interested in the elections. I'd want to add this and tying it to the geopolitics around 5G and things like that. And maybe even TikTok. We'll come in and say, TikTok and the connection to China. And we keep saying the same thing that TikTok would do, and the connection to China is the same thing that big tech companies that are allied to the US are doing, across the world. It's just that, we have maybe we have better democracies, maybe, for instance, in the US compared to what's in China with the CCP party, but it's the exact same thing. British soldiers train in Kenya. They have their base in Kenya. Kenya has been, the center where everything is happening across East Africa. The peace troops that we have maybe in Somalia, all of them have ties to Africa, to Kenya. And so what that means is the US, the UK, they're very interested in what's happening in Kenya. And so our elections, many times, is not what we actually desire, but we have this foreign interference. I think the moment we acknowledge, the same way we have acknowledged the role of Russia in the US elections, we need to acknowledge the interference by other governments in African elections. Calling out China means we need to call out the rest of the world for what they do in Africa.
I agree. If you allow me, in fact, and would really like to support and emphasize again what Marielle said here in terms of, the technologies and the irony that these technologies are, are shunned in the countries that they come from, Korea, that they're not, that countries like the US and others are banning them, like Portland, the city I live in, banned facial recognition in public places in September, the first city. But in Kenya, we are busy, accepting that technology, mostly from China, and beginning to install it. Just the sheer, I don't understand that, and I don't understand the irony of it, and the lack of accountability and transparency. Like, you can't publicly be able to access the records of who are these companies, who owns them, how are the vendor contracts developed in collaboration with our governments, who are the board members. The fact that when these technologies are being installed, there's no public consultation in whatsoever. You're collecting my information, but you're not involving me in how that information is being collected and why you're collecting it in the first place. And the conflation of the 16.9 SDG with digital, and the two of them are so different, that so different, and the impact, the policy and technology impacts in terms of the choices you make are really, really huge. And then the issue of security and the fact that a lot of this highly sensitive data is then put in a centralized database, and we all know that any data collected is data at risk. So it creates this honeypot that is accessible to anybody, who is able to hack and access this information and use it for whatever reason. So it's, and then again, yes, we keep talking about that. Yes, we are developing law legislation all over the continent, but then as you hear from Ghana, it's not empowered. They don't have the finances, they don't have the people. And I really strongly believe that legislation is as good as its enforcement. And so we need to make sure that we have empowered independent data protection authorities that have independent finances, are independent from the various structures of government, so they're able to do their jobs in a way that protects the everyday citizen. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mr. Brown, if you want to add into what Ms. Munyua said about, it really is about who's collecting the data, and there's risk involved in that, and you can add on to that.
Yeah, China's involvement in Ghana's identity landscape has to do mostly with the telecommunication or connectivity infrastructure through Huawei. They build most of our networks. They are supporting with the connectivity aspect, and then they are building the data centers we have. So that is the key role China is playing in Ghana's ID space, the digital ID space. So China doesn't provide or supply, there is no company in Ghana from China that supplies the biometric registration kits or verification devices, but rely on Chinese company, the Huawei company, for almost all our network connectivity, issues. That is a major role they play here.
That's right, and they have a very strong relationship with governments, be it autocratic governments or not, and there's risk involved with that, is what you're saying. Huawei has been highlighted for spying on political opponents, and we've seen in Uganda very thoroughly reported that. Rwanda is another case that we've seen about basically listening into political opposition parties or opponents, so in favor of a ruling party. So that those are great examples. I think we're reaching to the end of our discussion here, but I don't know if there are more questions coming in. We have a couple of minutes left. Victoria, is that correct?
We actually are a little bit over time. However, I did receive one wrap-up question I think is a good way to end the conversation. One attendee has asked me, based on all this information, despite the challenges, where can we go from here? What do you think the next steps should be, and what are the best practices we can learn from right now?
If you could briefly, all of you take this briefly. We'll start with Ms. Debos, maybe.
Yeah, maybe I start. I don't know what are the best practices, because I'm an academic, I'm not a practitioner. And what I can say to wrap up is that what we should pay, like, I mean, we in the West, in Europe or in the US, we should pay more attention to what is happening now in Africa. First, because Africa matters on its own term. And also second, because it may prefigure the future of the West. What's happening in Africa right now regarding election technology or the deployment of biometrics or facial recognition is not something from the past. Maybe for us in the West is something that that comes from the future. So maybe we should reverse our usual perspective here in Europe or in the US.
Ms. Bonyo, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think we need to cross-collaborate a little bit more, have these cross-learnings, for that South-to-South learning. What we are doing at the Lawyers Hub is to improve the skills of lawyers. We think that having a critical mass of lawyers who understand technology and how technology works, especially for different aspects of, of life, including elections, would be important to keep an eye on government and put that check and balance, because eventually lawyers become judges. And finally, what we're doing for elections in Kenya, we're treating that election as a process. And so we are running a fellowship. We're currently running a fundraising sort of, sprint to find out, can we get fellows who could join in and help us research? Can we build a coalition of people in tech and democracy across the continent? So we'll be able to respond, across different countries from the same sort of pot. Thank you.
Ms. Munyua?
Yeah, Mozilla, the organization I work with, has put out a really great white paper that looks at, provides recommendations on what are some of the basic protections that all, biometric ID systems should actually have, especially as they relate to democracy building activities like election. And there are 5 recommendations there that guide governments and other organizations toward what we really consider much more accountable, people-centered and inclusive biometric ID, national biometric ID systems. And that is, accountability that I've spoken to at length, the issue of participation, ensuring that, if the citizens are going to be, their biometrics are going to be used, they need to participate in how, why and what. The idea of multiplicity of choices, even if it's, an election, I should be allowed to identify myself in any other way that exists and not just through one single digital identity, focusing on inclusion, because most of these digital ID systems simply just increase and emphasize the exclusions that, currently, exist. And decentralization, this, a concerted technical effort to make sure that the data collected is collected and put in a decentralized database to avoid, abuse. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the last note from Mr. Brown.
Over the past decade, there has been an increase, a remarkable increase in the deployment of digital ID technologies in elections in Africa. And currently, almost half of all national level elections deploy digital equipment, such as the BVR kits, the biometric verification devices, and transmit election results electronically. This is a departure from the manual elections regime of identifying eligible voters through a physical voters ID card inspection by electoral officers during elections. This new paradigm indicates strong conviction of state actors and the voter population in the capability of the digital ID system in helping curtail the malpractices and procedural challenges that have characterized many elections on this continent. And I believe when we put in place a good legal infrastructure, technological and legal infrastructure to safeguard us going forward, it will be the best for the continent.
Well, we've come to the conclusion of our lively discussion, and we got great questions coming in from the audience. I would like to end on behalf of the Edward Murrow Center at the Fletcher School of Law. Thank you for having us. I'm Salem Solomon, and the English to Africa service within the Africa division. And thank you to all of our panelists who attended to give us their expertise. Marielle Debos from the University of Paris Nanterre, and Linda Bonyo with the Kenya Lawyers Hub, Elise Munyua with Mozilla Africa, and Emmanuel Brown with Ghana National Identification Authority. We thank you all for giving us your expertise. We hope to continue this discussion. We have your contact. We'll continue to monitor and see your work. I'll hand it back to Victoria, who was graceful enough to organize this and keep us. We were a little bit over time, but we had so many things to uncover. So thank you all.
No, I'm not going to continue too much since you guys have all done wonderful. I wish we had much more time to discuss, but if the audience members have anything else that they would like to learn, we can start off with the links that many of them have gracefully shared in the chat. And we wish you all a great day and hopefully to continue this conversation in the future.
Thank you.
Have a good time, everyone.